right, I'm joined today by the Raw Egg Nationalist, and we're going to be talking about his book, The Eggs Benedict Option. I thought I'd just begin by asking him about the title. Why'd you decide to call it the Eggs Benedict Option?
It's good to be back with you, Russell. Why did I call it the Benedict option? Well, I don't know. I had a copy of Rod Dreher's the Benedict option on the floor, and it was getting kind of scuffed. And I was sat on the lavatory one day, and I looked across and I saw this copy of the Benedict option, and I just suddenly thought the Eggs Benedict option. Uh, So I had a title for a book that I didn't even have a concept for yet. But so I worked from there really. But what I did was I mean the basic idea of the book is similar to the Benedict option in the sense that it's a recipe for an alternative way of life. It's a recipe for an alternative to the current system and the future potential sort of future system we might find ourselves under. So it's like a kind of a flight away from, a hostile world or a hostile potential world. So that's it basically. I mean, it was a funny thing that I just came up with looking at Rod Dreher's book, and then actually it seemed to fit pretty well with the concept for the book that I then came up with.
Hmm. Yeah, the book, I think last time we spoke about the link between like agriculture and culture or food and politics, and this book was about that. I think it's a very interesting topic. Obviously, the two words are etymologically linked, like agriculture and culture, but then they're
Yep.
linked in a much more profound way, and the book deals with that. So maybe we could start by talking a little bit about like the Neolithic revolution, which you described it as like the first great reset. But
Yep.
what were some of the implications for the people who underwent that, and how did it change their life? How did that agricultural revolution change their life?
Well, what I wanted to do with the book, it's a while since I've spoken about the book, actually, I mean, the book came out almost 2 years ago, certainly eighteen months ago, summer of 2022. And I have sort of talked about it quite furiously and written about it. But actually, it's been a little while since I've really talked about the book, but I've got it in front of me again. And since I read it, I can remember it. But what I really wanted to do with the book was consider the relationship between control of the food supply and social control more broadly. And so I started by going back to the Neolithic Revolution. Now that's the basically the dawn of agriculture. The About sort of 10 to 12,000 years ago in the Near East, an area that's called the gosh, what is it called? The Southwestern Alluvium. It's an area around the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers, basically in sort of modern day Iran, Iraq, Mesopotamia, basically. And that's where farming as an actual form of social organization, of agriculture as a form of social organization, really appears to have emerged. There had been experiments with certain with a certain amount of agriculture before that. We know that humans consumed wild grains, wild forms of wheat and other grains, sorghum, that kind of stuff, possibly for like 100,000 years before that point. And there seem to have been some small scale experiments with farming, but nothing like what took place in the Neolithic Revolution, when agriculture actually became the mode of production of the new kind of society that was organized around agriculture. And the Neolithic Revolution is presented generally as a very, very positive thing. This was the dawn of civilization. So mankind up to that point had been restricted to very small bands of hunter-gatherers, maybe a couple of 150, something like that, moving through the landscape, following the seasonal migrations of animals, of game, birds, um, maybe sort of occupying sites temporarily for certain periods of the year and then moving on. Um, but man's social organization was distinctly limited by the way that he was, essentially producing or hunting and gathering food. And then what happens is, the agricultural revolution comes along, and all of a sudden you can produce large surpluses of food, surpluses of grain, and that leads to the emergence of civilization, the first city states, the first urban centers, etc. And everything then that follows from that. That is it's a great turning point in human history. It's the beginning of civilization. You couldn't have had the industrial revolution without the agricultural revolution, etc. So it really sort of lights the touch paper on human progress. You have 190,000 years in which apparently not very much happens in the history of modern humans, and then all of a sudden within 10,000 years you go from the first fixed field farming and the domestication of pigs and other livestock to man landing on the moon and splitting the atom. So there's this story, this established narrative about the agricultural revolution being a great turning point in human history, a positive thing, and man was glad to get away from the itinerant life of a hunter-gatherer because, among other things, agriculture supposedly offered certainty. You have a harvest every year at the same time. You can guarantee a certain amount of food. You're not at the mercy of the elements. You're not at the mercy of fortune in the same way that you once were when you were tracking the migration of game and birds, etc. So there's this story, this established story. But actually, if you look at it, then in a different way, or in light of new evidence, of archaeological evidence, for instance, it becomes very clear that actually man paid a huge price for the advances that came, or the change of social organization of food production that came with the Neolithic. So we've known for a long time that through looking at skeletons, that the transition to agriculture wasn't necessarily a good thing for man's health. So we have, you have evidence of stunting, for example, of malnutrition. You have evidence of deformities associated with the very, very heavy labor that was involved in cultivating fields, in making bread. So you have, for instance, skeletal remains of women who were involved heavily in grinding and making bread, and they're on their knees the whole time, and their knees end up being deformed because they're on hard surfaces, rocking back and forth, grinding by hand grains to make flour to make bread. But there's much more evidence now that actually the Neolithic revolution wasn't something that took place voluntarily. So we have this idea that the Neolithic revolution took place because man just couldn't wait to get rid of, to kind of transcend his existence or get beyond his existence as a hunter-gatherer. Man really wanted to be something else, and agriculture offered him that opportunity. Well, actually, the evidence suggests that wasn't the case. The evidence suggests that, for the most part, people were coerced into becoming agriculturalists. And what appears to have happened is that actually you get these sort of predatory elites who come in from outside, and they basically enslaved hunter-gatherer populations, mobile populations, put them to work in these sort of very early city-states that they formed in the Middle East, and made them produce agricultural surpluses, and which were then, paid as taxation to the elites, who continued to live in a sort of splendid manner themselves, banqueting, eating a rich diet full of animal foods, etc. So there's this whole story of the Neolithic revolution actually looks much more like an imposition from outside rather than a voluntary choice by the first agriculturalists. And I think that in many respects, actually offers a kind of there are some deep analogies, I think, some deep similarities between the set of circumstances as we now understand them around the adoption of agriculture and the Great Reset, basically, and in particular the Great Reset vision of a plant-based global diet. And so that's really what the book is about. I set up this challenge to the established narrative about the agricultural revolution at the beginning, and I say, well, actually, this, in many respects, was the first great reset in history. And then I go on to analyze the sort of plan for a global plant-based diet in detail and to draw out some of the analogies in greater depth. But that's what I do. I'm setting up the agricultural revolution as a as more of a tale of woe than a tale of joy, in order to kind of draw out maybe um, some of the deeper sort of deeper ideas about the relationship between control of food and control of society more generally.
Yeah, I think when you first joined Twitter, your username was Turning Point Cattle Hoyak, wasn't it?
Yeah, or Turning Point Göbekli Tepe or something like that.
Oh,
Yeah.
right. Yeah.
So I was so I've always been on that train, if you will. I've always been one who's sort of claimed that the agricultural revolution and its consequences were a disaster for human history, for the human race rather. And I mean, I think that is true to a large extent. It's obviously it's brought its fair share of benefit too. I mean, I would be the first person to say that, but standing here speaking into my microphone on my front of my computer in my nice warm house, etc. But uh, nevertheless, I think that to present the story of the agricultural revolution as simply as a triumph is false, is patently false, and that's what I set out to do in the first chapter of the book, and then I build on that when I look at the sort of the the agricultural revolution that we're told is going to take place. And it's worth actually saying the World Economic Forum and all of these people who advocate for a global plant-based diet, and that is basically like every major corporation, every asset fund, and sort of financial institution, and governments, and NGOs, and the UN, and all of these other organizations that wield tremendous power individually and in concert. They actually describe the plant-based future as a new agricultural revolution. That is, those are the words that are used to describe it. So there are the parallels are absolutely not surface level parallels. They're deep parallels, and I try to draw them out as much as possible.
Mm. Well, I think last time we spoke, these ancient grain states like China, for example, you mentioned, well, you know what I mean. Like places like China, for example, the wall was just as much there to keep people in as it was to keep
Mm,
people out. Um, and you can imagine that that was the case with these states that existed 10,000 years ago. Maybe we
yes.
could so describe the Great Reset, this new agricultural revolution. What will the planetary diet look like, and what are some of the features of this new system of agriculture?
Well, so I mean, one of the things that I try to resist is the idea that there's some massive conspiracy taking place. I mean, I think it's very easy when you start to talk about the World Economic Forum uh, and the sort of climate change agenda and all that kind of stuff. It's very easy to get into lapse into a kind of conspiratorial frame of thinking. I mean, I think that the World Economic Forum is a kind of confidence operation. It's a nexus, and
Mm,
you know the global elites go to Davos for a reason. They don't go there to play act. They don't go. They're not going there for to engage in theatre. Totally. I mean, there is a theatrical element to it, I think. But what we're dealing with really is we're dealing with a kind of nexus of elite interest, and there very clearly is what we might call a plant-based agenda, which is part of a broader agenda for social and economic transformation. And the Great Reset is an easy shorthand to use to refer to that. But I think what's going on behind the scenes is quite complicated. I think that the way that power works is complicated, and I do say in the book, look, I don't think that Klaus Schwab is Emperor Palpatine.
Hmm.
Klaus Schwab isn't the secret ruler of the world or anything like that. I think he's a
I think,
competent
sorry, I'm
man.
just interjecting now. I hope you don't mind, but I
Yep.
think the World Economic Forum, yeah, exactly like you said, you don't need to buy into that narrative to recognize that I've spoken to people who have worked for like the agricultural ministry or something like that,
Mhm.
and they, generally speaking, their view is pretty much exactly like the World Economic Forum's, whether or not they
Yep.
listen to anything like that. They just generally have this view that, well, if we are to feed the world, XYZ has to happen. So
Yep.
even if you don't think that they're pulling the strings, they represent elite opinion very well, and they
Yes.
represent the people who make decisions. They represent, yeah, that thought they very well. So yeah, sorry, I just thought I'd say that.
No, no, no. It's no. I think you're right. And so what I'm really doing when I look at this thing called the planetary health diet, and that is a special diet that's been devised by the EAT Foundation, which is basically the World Economic Forum's food arm. It's their nutrition arm that looks into nutritional science and agriculture, etc. It's been so the planetary health diet has been devised by them, the EAT Foundation, and the Lancet, which is the medical journal, the prestigious medical journal. So they've come up with this idea for a diet, basically that it has to meet certain two parameters. Basically, one parameter is that they need to feed 10 billion people a healthy diet. That's apparently going to be the global population by 2050. So we need to feed 10 billion people a healthy diet, and we need to do so. This is the second parameter. We need to do so within the agreed boundaries of the various different uh, kind of climate change agreements, like especially the Paris Accords, that have already been signed up to by the majority of the world's governments. So they come up with this basically entirely plant-based diet to feed a global population of 10 billion people and reduce the carbon emissions of traditional agriculture. There's room for a very, very small amount of meat in the diet. So they actually come up with a like an ideal diet for the average citizen. So this is supposed to be, and this is the first example of this in human history. This is supposed to be the first global diet.
Mm.
So this is, everybody will be eating like this, right? And you'll have a calorie allocation and a macronutrient breakdown, where you'll get a certain amount of protein, certain amount of carbohydrates, certain amount of fat, and they'll come from particular sources, mostly plant-based oils, nuts and legumes, alternative proteins, etc. And then there's room for like the tiniest amount of animal products. So I think it's something like a quarter of an egg a day. You'd get like a wafer thin slice of meat. Um, and this is, but what underlies this vision of a plant-based future, and this is what I talk about at length in the book, is a total transformation of the food supply. Well, I say a total transformation. It's a transformation that's already been taking place over the last century. Corporations have taken over the food supply. They don't own it totally yet, but this great reset vision of the future is one in which of a global plant-based diet is one in which corporations will control the food supply. Full stop. It's built on, among other things, it's built on the use of new genetically modified high yield crops, wheat, etc., soy, all of which are or will be patented and owned by corporations. We're talking about a transition to a totally corporate-based system of food production, basically. So that's a very clear parallel too with the Neolithic revolution, the agricultural revolution in the Near East. You have a total transformation of the way that food is produced, which leads to a which leads to a change in the way that in the types of food that are consumed, and it also leads to profound social changes. So in the Neolithic, then you have slavery. You have massive slavery. People they're corralled into these new agricultural settlements, and they're forced to work by an elite that doesn't work. And something very similar is happening today, or will potentially happen, if this sort of vision of social transformation coupled with economic and agricultural and food transformation also takes place. So it's about much more than just getting people to eat plants instead of animal products. It's about enhancing corporate control of the food supply and actually making it total. And so that's a trend that has been, as I say, that's been taking place over the last 100 or so years. It's already been a profound transformation of the way that food is produced and consumed, types of foods that are produced and consumed as well. Processed food didn't exist until, or modern processed food didn't exist until the sort of 1940s, 1950s, and that was stuffed with all sorts of novel food ingredients, things like vegetable and seed oils, new food additives, emulsifiers, colorings, texturizers, antimicrobials, all that kind of stuff. But this will be a transformation on a transformation, or rather, it will bring that transformation to its fruition. And as I say in the book, it will totally alienate man for the first time, I think, in his history from production of food. Ordinary people will be totally reliant on corporations to produce their food, which will lend them enormous power,
Mm.
and the implications of that are, I try to get into in depth. The implications not only for health, because I think that plant-based diets are dysgenic. I think that they're maladaptive, and we aren't supposed to live by plants alone, or even I think for a significant proportion of our diets to be plant-based. But also, this idea of a plant-based future, has profound consequences for our freedom and for politics. So I try to draw out the physical and the social and economic implications of this in depth in the chapters that follow the first chapter on the Neolithic Revolution.
Yeah, it's almost like a feature of civilization or a pattern that you can recognize is that the monopolization of agriculture tends to also correspond with a reduction in freedom. So I think that Victor Davis Hanson guy points out that the Roman Republic was made up of small farmers who also fought in the army. And as Rome began to transition to an empire, you had these monopolies essentially, and the farming was done by slaves, and most of the profits were going to a small group of people. And it feels like something similar went on throughout the Western world. You look at a country like Australia, or maybe America's an even better example. The sort of Jeffersonian democracy, the idea of the small farmer, and that ideal is probably already pretty much completely disappeared. But I think the eggs Benedict option, in a way, is a revival of that ideal, of that like sort of Jeffersonian, small scale, like small farm ownership, but then also, valuing independence, not just in like an abstract way, but in a very tangible way. Like independence isn't just a political idea or ideal. It's something that is very real. It's independence of your food supply. So anyway, I think maybe we could talk about the eggs Benedict option, which is an alternative to everything we've been speaking about.
Yeah, so I try to I did when I read the book, I didn't just want to lay out the problem and say, "Oh no, look, this is going to be terrible if if we end up in this future where corporations control the food supply and we're forced to eat a plant-based diet and we don't have access to any animal product." Um I wanted to lay out a positive alternative, and that is the eggs Benedict option. That's the second half of the book. And what I really try to do is I try to well, I start with the example of this practice, this very ancient practice called household gardening in Russia. And basically, what it is it's like the peasant mode of agriculture. It's what ordinary Russian people have done for 1,000 years, really, which is to have small plots of land that they tend to uh, and that produce a significant proportion of the food that they eat. And uh, there was a wonderful PhD that was written about, well, almost 20 years ago now, actually, by a Russian chap who was at an American university, University of Missouri, I think, or something like that, and a guy called Leonard Sharashkin, and he studied household gardening as it takes place now in the modern world, and in modern Russia, and uh, he basically showed that a significant proportion of and I mean a significant proportion, like something like more than 50% by value of the food that is produced in Russia. And Russia is you need to remember, Russia is a serious agricultural nation. Russia produces huge amounts of grain. Africa, in particular, is almost totally reliant on Russian or Ukrainian grain, which is why the Ukraine-Russia war has been quite worrying, I think, for a lot of people, including the leaders of African nations. But maybe like 50% or more, I forget the exact statistics, of the food by value in Russia was, at the time of Leonid Shrashkin's PhD in the early 2000s, produced by ordinary people in their own gardens, plots of land that they have. So, um, you know, Russia is an urban nation now. It's predominantly an urban nation, but even so, urban dwellers in Russia, they have these plots of land outside the cities in the countryside that they go to regularly at the weekend during the week, and they cultivate food and they eat it and they share it with their neighbors and their families, um, uh, and it offers a wide array of benefits really for the Russian people. And it's not just plants either. They keep animals, so they have chickens, they keep cows and have milk, and it produces quite a significant proportion of meat and animal products as well. And it offers a variety of benefits to the Russian people, not only um, access to high quality organic produce because it is a largely organic system, but it offers things like food security, and that was very, very dramatically illustrated during the fall of the Soviet Union, when Russia probably would have had a famine uh, if it hadn't been for these household gardens. Because the Soviet industrial system of agriculture basically started to collapse, and couldn't distribute food uh, as it had done before. And so ordinary people were thrown back on their own resources and their own little household gardens, which they used to produce food, potatoes, milk, eggs, etc., fruit. and they managed to feed themselves through a period of profound turmoil, which is something that actually couldn't happen in the West now. And this is one of the principal strengths of the system is that of the household guarding system is that it sits alongside the industrial system, and so you have an industrial system of food production, and you have this local community-based system of food production as well, and they complement each other. It's uh, having a multiplicity of systems rather than just reliance on a single system is a great strength, because if there's a shock to one, then the other can you know can compensate. Uh, and we don't have that. We just have one system at one scale, basically, in the West, especially in the US, which is probably the most reliant on industrial agriculture for the production of its food. That's where the industrial agricultural system is most advanced. So I take this household gardening system as a kind of ideal example for what actually we might be able to do in the West as well, because it's worth remembering that Russia, for all its faults and its problems, is nevertheless an industrial nation. It is a modern industrial nation, 150 odd million people, maybe slightly more than 150 million. It's an industrial nation. It's a powerhouse. It has nuclear weapons, hypersonic missiles. It's capable of sending people into space. There's no reason why other industrial nations couldn't then, this is my argument, couldn't adopt a similar system where ordinary people produce a significant proportion of their own food. And that's basically the Eggs Benedict option, as far as I see it, is a return to a food system that actually is responsive and emerges out of the needs of ordinary people and local communities, rather than the dictates of corporations. So, the industrial food supply primarily serve the interests and the profit motive of corporations, whereas the household gardening system is about providing ordinary people with nutritious, healthy food that they actually want to eat. So that really is, it's like the Eggs Benedict option section of the book really is a case study of how agriculture is done in Russia, how it's different from the way that agriculture is done in the West today, but actually how it's similar to how agriculture used to be done in the West. So I talk about, for instance, the fact that, in World War II and in World War One, I believe as well, then there were movements to get people to go back to the land to cultivate victory gardens, I think they were called in the US, and people ended up producing actually a lot of food in their own garden, and so I think we could do it again if there were a powerful enough narrative behind it, as powerful enough a narrative as you know fighting for the future of democracy was in World War II, then actually I think you could inspire people actually to consider that actually maybe they ought to be producing some of their food, that they ought to be involved that they ought to take more interest in the production of food, and that actually that they have lost a significant measure of freedom by surrendering the control of the food supply to these entities that don't actually care about ordinary people. So that's really what the Eggs Benedict option is about in the second half of the book. It's about providing an alternative, human-centered, local community-centered vision of food production, and how that could be linked more broadly to a sort of attempt to regain freedoms that have been lost over the last century or so.
Yeah, one of the things that I was actually really impressed with was if you look at like the total agricultural output of Russia, like you said, this industrial nation, so much of it does come from these small farms. It's genuinely very, very impressive. Um, anyway, I thought we might talk now a bit about your own, like you've taken the eggs Benedict option. You know, I know that you live somewhere in the rural UK or rural England, and you have yourself started your own garden, and I thought you might just tell us a little bit about that process of growing a garden, planting your own food, how you found it.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, well, I like to practice what I preach, and as much as I can. And yeah, I mean, it's been a long term uh dream for me to farm, even on a small scale. I've often sort of wanted. I've probably romanticized being a farmer because being a farmer is hard. But I have some land. I have a nice plot of land, about a quarter acre, and yeah, I have the beginnings of a proper household garden. I've got plans for chickens and for some beehives. My grandfather keeps bees, so he's going to help me with that. And yes, it's I mean, one of the things actually that I make clear in the book, and that I should probably make clear here, is that actually these Russians who tend to their household gardens, they don't actually spend a huge amount of time doing so. So it's not like, first of all, it's not their job. So these people have jobs that, they work normally, and then they tend to their gardens on the side. It's not income for them as such. And in fact, most of them don't sell their produce. They might barter some of it with their neighbors, but it's not a job in any sense. They're producing food for themselves and their families and their friends. But on average, according to this chap, Leonard Sharashkin, who wrote the PhD that I reference throughout the book, they spend on average about 17 hours a week working on their gardens. And they do so for a short growing period, because there is the growing period in Russia is pretty short. It's like 4 months of the year. So for 4 months of the year, let's say, for argument's sake, they spend an average of about 17 hours a week in their gardens. Well, in America, the average person spends something like, I think it's 32 hours a week watching the television, or did spend 32 hours a week watching the television. It's probably now, you know, 32 hours plus on the television and mobile phones and computers and all that kind of stuff. So you absolutely can't say that people don't have time to do this kind of stuff. They do. It's just that they're spending it, watching the television or playing on their mobile phones or computers or whatever. So this isn't some kind of I'm not arguing that people should go back to being peasants. Basically, I'm not saying that people should abandon the modern world and become peasants. No, I'm saying that with a certain amount of commitment each week, you could actually create and reap the benefits of an incredibly productive uh, garden, uh, just like the Russians do. And it does require work, of course, and you have to. I think you probably have to curb your ambitions. You will, if you decide to do something like this, you'll probably think, oh, yeah, I'm gonna have a milk cow or a milk goat, and I'm gonna have beehives, and I'll have ducks and chickens and X and Y and Z, and actually, you'll discover that it's more of a commitment than you thought, but also um, that you just have to approach it slowly and get to know what you're doing, especially if you have absolutely no experience whatsoever of cultivation. I mean, I've been growing stuff for some years in a less committed manner, I think, than I am now, and I've never kept livestock of any sort, so that's new to me. I've helped my grandfather out with his bees, but I've never kept chickens or anything like that, so that's new for me. So it's a learning process, and it will take you time. It will probably take you, a couple of years really to get well set up. But actually, even in your first year, then if you plant some trees, some fruit trees, and some fruit bushes and vegetables, etc., then you can reap a significant crop, more than you will know what to do with actually, and that's certainly what I've found. And yeah, I think I do think that you will be surprised by how much you can produce, even in a small garden. You don't need a quarter acre. You could just have even a standard garden. You could actually produce, you know, enough fruit to keep you going, for most of the year, and plenty of veg and all the herbs that you need. Just with a small herb patch. Um, so it's yeah. I mean, I would encourage anybody with some space, even if you've only got a patio and you can only have plants in pots, or even a windowsill where you can have some window boxes, maybe just with some herbs. I would encourage anybody to try just producing a little bit of food, and if you've never done that before, I think it will be a revelation for you, because you'll realize not only how satisfying it is to do, how satisfying it is to tend to the natural world, and to produce your own food, but also how good it is. I mean, there's very little comparison between a homegrown tomato and the kind of dreck that you would buy in the supermarket. That has been picked before it was ripe and sprayed with ethylene gas in the back of a truck in transit to ripen. There's just no comparison between a tomato, I say in inverted commas, like that, and the kind of thing that you would grow on a nice, in your greenhouse at home, or on against a sunny wall. Um, so yeah, I mean, I think it's one of these things like exercising. I say that exercise is transformative. Well, I think, and it is, but I also think that producing your own food is transformative, and it will make you see actually the whole world, or a significant, it has implications for your much broader implications for your worldview. And I think that the more people that can actually get back to a sort of hands-on, direct relationship with their food, the better.
Absolutely. I was even just thinking about the impact it has for social relations within a community. If you have a lot
Mm,
of people doing this, very quickly you have an increase in the interactions going on, because you have
yeah.
people trading things. And I
Yep.
think that like sustained interaction that comes from, exchanging goods with your neighbors is actually often like what actually builds a solid community.
Yeah. Well, that's something that comes through very, very clearly from the work on Russian household gardens, is just how much this daily sort of interaction between these local producers of food sustains the community. People have, when they harvest their fruits and vegetables, then they exchange them, but they also have, suppers and lunches in their gardens, and everyone comes around, and they share the food, and I mean, that is what communities are made of. That is how communities are created. It's not A community isn't just people all living together in proximity to one another, in a set sort of defined territory. It's people interacting and exchanging and giving one another stuff, and looking out for one another as well. And that is, I think that the exchange of produce, and this sort of shared endeavor of producing food is a very, very good way of bringing people together.
I also imagine it's accompanied by a sense of security, because um, this sort of model of consumption with zero production is very fragile, because you recognize if something
Yes.
does go wrong, that you're totally at the whims of these centralized or these big corporations. whilst if you are producing even a small amount of food and you have neighbors doing something similar, already you have a sort of local system that you can rely on to some degree if the central one does break down.
Yeah, yeah. Well, that's one of the key strengths of this Russian household gardening system is that, like I said, the Soviet Union fell, the industrial agricultural system couldn't keep up, and so people were thrown back on their own resources. And instead of there being a famine, as there might otherwise have been, there wasn't. The people were okay. The people survived for the most part, and that should be a lesson to us all. Especially, I talk about the pandemic. I talk about the supply chain disruption that took place during the pandemic. All of a sudden, you couldn't get meat, you couldn't get eggs, you couldn't get milk, and that should have been a wake up call
Mm,
to people about the fragility of the you know of the food supply and the last second sort of delivery model that we have, where these supply chains are built on very very precise minute timings, and everything is minutely coordinated and sort of stage managed. And actually, it doesn't take much for a system like that to collapse. And then if it does, well, what happens? Well, okay, you've got some food that you might have hoarded, maybe, but then what after that? Can you produce food for yourself? Can you find food? I mean, a lot of people actually. I seem to remember a story about people in the US going back to hunting, going off into the forest and hunting much more for meat, for game during the pandemic. That was actually a big thing, because people couldn't get meat. But that a lot of people weren't able to do that and aren't going to be able to do that. And so, yeah, I mean, I think that's a very timely was a very timely aspect of the book, actually, that it was written
mm,
during the pandemic when all of that stuff was going on. And it was quite plain to see that actually just relying on an industrial system of agriculture, uh, when it works, it's fine. But then when it doesn't work, what's the alternative? What are you going to do?
I think that people had one of two responses to that event, which was either when they were going through it, like there's this sort of collective amnesia for a lot of people. It's like it
Mm,
almost never
yep.
happened. And then I think there's a smaller group of people, maybe 20%, who have realized just how at the mercy of these corporations and at the mercy of governments, and they've started to realize I need to set up some sort of alternative system
Yeah.
in case something like that happens again, because otherwise, yeah, I'm just at the whims of these big corporations and big governments. Anyway, I thought before we finish, because I don't want to keep you too long, I'd be interested in hearing what you're up to now. I know that you're being kept very busy running Man's World, but have you got any ideas for another book in the future or anything like that?
Yeah, well. So at the moment, I'm putting together a collection of all of my essays, or some, well, not all of my essays, some of my essays that I've written over the last 4 years for American Mind and American Greatness and the Epoch Times and other publications like that. I've written. Actually, I totted it all up. I've written, like 350,000, nearly 400,000 words over the last 4 years in essays, etc. So there's a lot of stuff, and I'm sorting it out, and I'm putting that together as a book of essays that will be out reasonably soon. So you can get all of my essays in one, or a large, significant proportion, a curated selection of them in one place, which I hope people will like, because they're on a really quite a wide variety of topics. It's not just about food. It's not just about health. uh, all sorts of stuff. So there's that, and then I am going, and that's going to be self-published on Amazon, I think. And then I am. in the process of signing a proper book deal to write my next book, which is going to be called The Last Men, Liberalism and the Death of Masculinity. And that's going to be a full book length book about some of the themes explored in the Tucker Carlson documentary, The End of Men, that I was in year and a half ago now. The relationship between testosterone decline and social decline, etc., masculinity, all that kind of stuff, book length treatment of those topics, why we should care about testosterone decline and the decline of masculinity, etc. The book's all planned out. I'm just getting ready to sign the contract and hopefully have a reasonably nice little advance on the book, and then I will get writing, and that will be out next year.
Amazing, amazing. That's great to hear. Well, thank you so much for taking the time. I look forward to reading your next book. That'll be great.
Thank you. Yeah, no, look, it's always a pleasure talking to you, Russell, and we should yeah, we should do it again. And it's nice. It's been nice to talk about the eggs Benedict option, actually, because I haven't spoken about it, like I said, in quite some time.
Well, I imagine that next time we speak, hopefully it's about your new book. Hopefully it's been published and out, and we can talk about that because it sounds very interesting.
Yeah, fancy. No, we absolutely will. We absolutely will, my friend. Thank you.
Fantastic. All right. Enjoy the rest of your night, and yeah, catch you later.